What's up, everybody? Core U's Bloody History. We're back. 8 plus 2 equals 10. In case you can't fucking count, like a lot of people out there can't count. So, I know I said I was going to go over the slides today, but I don't feel like doing that. So, we'll do it tomorrow or whenever. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to continue right from where we left off. Looks like the statement of George Hickey. To Gerald Bain, Special Agent in Charge, White House Detail, United States Secret Service, from George Hickey, Jr., Special Agent, White House Detail, White House Garage, U.S. Secret Service. Subject, activities of S.A. George W. Hickey, Jr., from the time he arrived at Love Airfield, Dallas, Texas, Thursday, November 21st, 1963, to the time he departed from Love Airfield, Friday, November 22nd, 1963. Report, Thursday, November 21st, 63. I arrived at Love Field, Dallas, Texas, 6:05 p.m. via Air Force C-130 plane number 12373. United States Air Force flight order number 597, dated November 15th, 1963. Giving the names and rank of the crew of the above plane as attached to this report and initialed by me this date. S.A. Samuel Kinney was the senior agent aboard the plane, which was being used in presidential support to transport Secret Service cars 100X and 679X. We were met at the airport by SAIC, that's Special Agent in Charge Forrest V. Sorrells of the Dallas Field Office, and S.A. Winston G. Lawson, the advance agent for the White House Secret Service detail. S.A. Kinney unloaded 679X, and I unloaded 100X from the plane. The drivers of the above cars, accompanied by Agents Sorrells and Lawson, then drove to the garage beneath the airport's main terminal building, where security was placed on the cars by Dallas Police Department as arranged by SAIC Sorrells. Agents Kinney, Hickey, Lawson, and Sorrells then drove in a Dallas field office car to the Sheraton Hotel in Dallas, where reservations had been made for us. Agent Kinney and I then went to our room to wash and change clothes before dinner. We met with Agent Lawson, Warrant Officer Arthur Bales of the White House Signal Agency, and Jack Putterbaugh, a Democratic National Committeeman for that area, at about 8:30 p.m. I don't know if we've already said this, but Jack Putterbaugh, we need to pull everything on Jack Putterbaugh if we haven't already. At the hotel and drove to the Dallas Trade Mart, where the president was to speak the next day. The premises were checked by Agent Lawson for final security details. At about 9:15 p.m., we departed and went to dinner. Finished about 11 p.m. and proceeded back to the Sheraton Hotel, where we parted company and went to our respective rooms. Friday, November 22nd, 1963, I woke 7 a.m., washed, packed suitcase, checked out of hotel, and had breakfast. About 8:30 a.m., Agent Sorrells met Agent Kinney and me outside the hotel and drove to the airport, arriving about 9 a.m. We went directly to the garage and relieved the police of the security of the cars. Washed and cleaned both cars and checked outside, inside, and underneath for security violations, none found. We drove the cars to the area where the president was to be met about 11 a.m. Cars were kept under close observation until the arrival of the president, when Agent William Greer of the White House detail took over control of 100X and Agent Kinney 679X. The president and his party then proceeded up to the fence, holding the crowd back, and greeted and shook hands with them. I assisted agents on the detail to make a path for them and helped Agent Greer keep the cars abreast of the president as he moved along the length of the fence. After the president and his party entered and were seated in 100X, I entered 679X, as I had been instructed to do by Agent Lawson. I was seated in the rear left side seat. The shift leader, Emery Roberts, had instructed me to take control of the AR-15 rifle whenever I was riding in 679X as an extra man. I did this and had the ammunition clip inserted in the rifle and placed the rifle within easy reach of me. The motorcade then left the airport and proceeded along the parade route. Just prior to the shooting, the presidential car turned left at the intersection and started down an incline towards the underpass, followed by 679X. After a very short distance, I heard a loud report, which sounded like a firecracker. It appeared to come from the right and rear and seemed to me to be at ground level. I stood up and looked to my right and rear in an attempt to identify it. Nothing caught my attention except people shouting and cheering. A disturbance in 679X caused me to look forward toward the president's car. Perhaps 2 or 3 seconds elapsed from the time I looked to the rear and then looked at the president. He was slumped forward and to his left and was straightening up to an almost erect sitting position as I turned and looked. At the moment he was almost sitting erect, I heard 2 reports which I thought were shots and that appeared to be, to me, completely different in sound than the first report, and were in such a rapid succession that there seemed to be practically no time element between them. It looked to me as if the president was struck in the right upper rear of his head. The first shot of the second 2 seemed as if it was missed because the hair on the right side of his head flew forward, and there didn't seem to be any impact against his head. The last shot seemed to hit his head and cause a noise at the point of impact, which made him fall forward and to his left again. Possibly 4 or 5 seconds elapsed from the sound of the first report and the last. At the end of the last report, I reached the bottom of the car and picked up the AR-15 rifle, cocked it, and loaded it, and turned to the rear. At this point, the cars were passing under overpass, and as a result, we had left the scene of the shooting. I kept the AR-15 rifle ready as we proceeded at a high rate of speed to the hospital. Agent Clint Hill was riding across the rear and the top of 100X in a horizontal position. He looked into the rear of 100X and turned toward 679X and shook his head several times. I received the impression that the president at least was seriously injured. So I need to point something out here. I've pointed this out on previous statements, but it is becoming apparent that Clint Hill never stood in the back seat of the president's limousine. Never. Never, never, never. I believe that many of the pictures that we see from the profile, from the side of Clint Hill standing on or near the trunk or back seat are pictures that were taken from the recreation of the events which happened, if I'm not mistaken, several days or weeks after the assassination. So this is something I went over this a couple times. I even had a long conversation with Ryder Lee about this, and because he asked me about this. But you have the Secret Service events that day, and then shortly after that, you had them come back to Dallas to do a recreation, not to film it or anything, but as an investigative tool. And I know that there were fucking films of that taken, and I know that there were photographs of that taken, and I'm convinced that some of those photographs made their way into the standard photographs, the real photographs of November 22nd, right? Because the photographs we're told were taken that day don't make any fucking sense. And every single Secret Service agent who's a sworn law enforcement officer says that Clint Hill never left the trunk of the fucking car. He hopped up there and he laid down on the trunk of the car, keeping Jackie down, and that was it. We can see his head hanging over the side of the car from looking at McIntyre photo number 1. So the point I'm making here, to summarize, is that every single goddamn Secret Service agent said that Clint Hill laid on the trunk and never left there. They don't say anything about him standing in the back seat. And there was somebody standing in the back seat holding what appears to me to be a rifle at a 45-degree angle. Call me crazy. Still possible. Agent Clint Hill was riding across the rear and top of 100X in a horizontal position. He looked into the rear of 100X and turned towards 679X and shook his head several times. I received the impression that the president at least was very seriously injured. A few moments later, shift leader Emery Roberts turned to the rest of us in the car and said words to the effect that when we arrive at the hospital, some of us would have to give additional protection to the vice president and take him to a place of safety. He assigned 2 of the agents in the car to this duty. I was told to have the AR-15 ready for use if needed. When we arrived at the hospital, the president and Governor Conley were taken inside, and about the same time the vice president had arrived. I requested him to come into the hospital to a place of safety, and he was surrounded by his detail and the other assigned agents and myself and led into the hospital. When he entered, I returned the gun to 679X as ordered by Agent Roberts. By this time, a great number of police had arrived with newsmen and others in the motorcade, and Agent Kinney and I stood by the cars. Agent Kinney requested that I go and see if I could find out what happened, what was to be done with the cars. As I was on my way into the hospital to do this, Mr. Kenneth O'Donnell asked me to take him to where the president was. because he could not get by the police. I did this, and he joined Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. Dave Powers outside the president's operating room. Agent John D. Reedy was stationed outside this room, and he requested that I take his place for a few moments and to allow no unauthorized persons to enter or linger outside the door, and to care for Mrs. Kennedy if necessary. I did this until Agent Reedy returned and relieved me. As I was leaving to go back to the area where Agent Roberts was, Mr. Dave Powers asked me to get a priest, which I did. Agent Roberts informed me to wait until later when a decision might be made about the cars. Upon returning to the vehicles, I assisted Agent Kinney to put the tops on the cars. A short time later, Agent Roy Kellerman told Agent Kinney and me to take the cars to the plane and stand by for orders. Agent Kinney drove 679 and I 100X to the plane and loaded them and secured the plane, allowing no one to enter except the regular crew. After Air Force Number 1 left, we received orders to depart for Washington, D.C. and return the cars to the garage and preserve any evidence that might be in them. Departed Love Airfield, Dallas, Texas, via USAF plane number 12373 at 3:35 p.m. The above report has been initialed by the below signed on each of its 4 pages, including the attached flight sheet. George W. Hickey, Jr., Special Agent, Secret Service. Just prior to the shooting, I was seated in the rear of SS-679X on the left side. As 100X made the turn and proceeded a short distance, I heard what seemed to me that a firecracker exploded to the right and rear. I stood partially up and turned to the rear to see if I could observe anything. Nothing was observed, and I turned around and looked at the president's car. The president was slumped to the left in the car. I observed him come up. I heard what appeared to be 2 shots, and it seemed as if the right side of his head was hit and his hair flew forward. I then reached down, picked up the AR-15, cocked and loaded it, and stood partway up in the car and looked about. By this time, 100X and 679X had passed under the overpass and was proceeding at a high rate of speed towards the hospital. Clint Hill, who was lying on the trunk of the president's car, looked into the car and then looked back at us and shook his head. Emory Roberts then turned around and said to words of his this effect that we had to take care of the vice president. He assigned 2 agents to go to him the minute we arrived at the hospital. He told me to stand by with the AR-15 in case there was any danger to the vice president when we arrived at the hospital. I did this, and after the vice president was escorted into the hospital, I returned the gun to the car. Kenneth O'Donnell asked me to take him into the hospital. He couldn't get by the local police. I took him into the area where the president was and assisted the agent outside the door to keep the people away who didn't belong there. I was then relieved and went back to the cars where I assisted Agent Kinney to put the plastic top on 100X. We were then told by Roy Kellerman to take the cars to the plane and stand by. I drove 100X to the plane, loaded it in company with Agent Kinney. We stood by until the plane took off. And that's George Hickey as his statement from 11/22/63. Next, we have a memorandum to the chief from Special Agent Youngblood, Vice Presidential Detail. Statement of SAIC Rufus W. Youngblood, Vice Presidential Detail, Office 1-22, concerning details of events occurring in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. At 11:35 a.m., Air Force 2 plane arrived at Love Field, Dallas, Texas. Vice President, Mrs. Johnson, and others were aboard this plane, including 8th SAC Thomas Lem Johns, S.A. Warren W. Taylor, and myself of the Vice Presidential Detail, Office 1-22. S.A. Jerry D. Kivett of the Vice Presidential Detail was on the ground in Dallas ahead of us. We arrived before the presidential aircraft, and the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson were met by numerous dignitaries when they disembarked from the plane. 8th SAC Johns, S.A. Taylor, and myself were staying in the immediate vicinity of Vice President and Mrs. Johnson. S.A. Kivett was working intermittently with us and also keeping up with location of cars, the other airplane, etc. Prior to the arrival of the presidential aircraft, I led the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson to the reception line, and when Air Force One was in position and the ramp was in place, led them to foot of ramp. They greeted the president and the first lady upon their arrival. We later followed the presidential couple, and when the presidential couple went along the fence to greet the public, we did likewise, but in a separate group. During this time, I was always in close proximity to the vice president. Warren Taylor was in close proximity to Mrs. Johnson, and we were both being assisted by Johns and Kivett. When the president took his position in the presidential vehicle, we did likewise in the vice presidential vehicle. The following persons were in the vice presidential vehicle when the motorcade departed from the airport at approximately 11:50 a.m. Central Time. In the front seat was driver Herschel Jacks, Texas Highway Patrol. And the other front seat was ASIC Youngblood. Rear seats behind the driver was Senator Ralph Yarborough, and the rear seat in the middle was Mrs. Johnson, and behind ASIC Youngblood was the vice president. The above vehicle was a four-door Lincoln convertible with the top down. I had a shoulder strap DCN portable two-way radio with me on Baker frequency. The following persons loaded into the vice presidential follow-up car. The driver, ASAC Johns, that's Lem Johns, S.A. Warren W. Taylor, S.A. Kivett, and Mr. Cliff Carter, member of the vice president's staff. ASAC Johns had a portable radio, which was the companion of the one I had also on Baker frequency. This vice presidential follow-up car also had a portable two-way radio set on Charlie frequency. When we departed from the airport, the motorcade order was lead car, presidential follow-up car, vice presidential follow-up car, other cars, press dignitaries, buses, etc. During the motorcade, the order listed above was not changed and remained so until we arrived at the hospital. Upon leaving the airport, we were proceeding to the Trade Mart and were due to arrive there at 12:30 p.m. We were proceeding at a slow pace to this destination, which was entirely normal due to the large crowds of people along both sides of the motorcade route. During our motorcade, the presidential vehicle made some stops to greet well-wishers. Our speed and the stops were naturally controlled by the presidential car. I was working both in and out of the vice presidential car on these stops. To my recollection, the vice president did not leave the vehicle during the motorcade. Several times during the motorcade, I was in radio contact with the vice presidential follow-up car concerning times, distances, etc. During the motorcade, I instructed our driver to keep some distance, about 2 or 3 car lengths behind the presidential follow-up car while we were going at slow speeds. The motorcade had just cleared the congested downtown area and made a right turn. I recall observing an illuminated clock sign on a building. The time was 12:30 p.m., which was the time we were due to be at the Trade Mart. The motorcade then made a left turn, and the sidewalk crowds were beginning to diminish in size. I observed a grassy plot to my right in back of the small crowd of bystanders on the sidewalk. Some tall buildings, a downhill grade ahead where the street went under what appeared to be a railroad overpass. We were about 2 car lengths behind the presidential follow-up car at this time. I heard an explosion. I was not sure whether it was a firecracker, bomb, bullet, or other explosion. I looked at whatever I could quickly survey and could not see anything which would indicate the origin of this noise. I noticed that the movements in the presidential car were very abnormal, and at practically the same time, the movements in the presidential follow-up car were abnormal. I turned in my seat and with my left arm grasped and shoved the vice president at his right shoulder, down and towards Mrs. Johnson and Senator Yarborough. At the same time, I shouted, "Get down." I believe I said this more than once and directed it to the vice president and the other occupants of the rear seat. They all responded very rapidly. I quickly looked all around again, could see nothing to shoot at, and so I stepped over into the back seat and sat on top of the vice president. I sat in a crouched position and issued orders to the driver. During this time, I heard 2 more explosion noises and observed S.A. Hickey in the presidential follow-up car poised on the car with the AR-15 rifle looking toward the buildings. The second and third explosions made the same type of sound that the first one did as far as I could tell, but by this time I was of the belief that they definitely were shots, not bombs or firecrackers. I am not sure that I was on top of the vice president before the second shot. He says I was. All of the above related events from the beginning at the sound of the first shot to the sound of the third shot happened within a few seconds. In my crouched position, I observed the people on the streets to scatter, heard some shouts, saw the motorcade increase speed, and I knew we were making a rapid evacuation. I shouted to the driver to stick with them and stay close. When we began moving very fast, I then called on my portable radio, which I had with me, to the vice presidential follow-up car and ordered them to switch to Charlie frequency. As I switched to Charlie frequency, I heard some transmissions from the presidential follow-up car. From fragments of what I heard and what I saw, I knew that the president had suffered injury. I could see an agent who had previously run from the presidential follow-up car, although I did not observe this when it happened. Lying across the trunk turtle of the president car, above me, the president and Mrs. Kennedy. I heard enough radio transmission to know we were headed for a hospital. I could also see the agents in the presidential follow-up car waving our car to come up close, and I told our driver to stay as close and go as fast as he could without having a wreck. This driver wasn't talkative, and he wasn't excitable. He responded to everything I said. He did an excellent job. During this ride to the hospital, I had some brief conversations with the vice president and Senator Yarborough in response to their questions. I told the vice president that the president must have been shot or wounded, but I did not know his condition. I told the vice president and Mrs. Johnson to follow me and the agents as closely and quickly as possible. When we get to our destination, they agreed to do this. When we got to the hospital, my agents, S.A.'s Kivett and W. Taylor from the vice presidential follow-up car, were on the ground by the time we stopped. Also, some agents from the presidential follow-up car were coming back to assist us. We left the car immediately. Vice President and Mrs. Johnson and myself, and surrounded by agents, went into the hospital and quickly into a corner of a large room with partitions. We did not stop to look at or for the presidential car occupants. Senator Yarborough did not go with us. I told one agent, Glenn Bennett, Protective Research Section, to stop any traffic into the room unless he knew the person to be a member of our party. Vice President and Mrs. Johnson and myself were in the corner of the room while S.A.'s Kivett and W. Taylor were securing the room by evacuating a couple of occupants and closing blinds, shades, etc. They remained in our immediate proximity. We were shortly joined by Atzak Johns, Congressman Thornberry, Congressman Brooks, and Cliff Carter. Atzak Roberts' White House detail came in and told us that the vice president was badly wounded and probably would not live. I advised the vice president that we should evacuate the hospital and go to the airplane and return to Washington, D.C. and the White House. At this time, I had no knowledge of whether the actions that caused the president to be shot were the work of one man, a small group, or what. I felt that the safest place for him, and in the best interest of all concerned, was in the White House. Others who were present also concurred. We were later joined by Asa Kellerman, who reported the president's condition was very critical. Ken O'Donnell came to the room and told us the same thing, and said we should return to Washington. During all of this time, many things occurred, and I don't recall now the exact order. I talked to Mrs. Johns and obtained information about Linda and Lucy and told S.A. Kivett to make the necessary calls to have them placed under Secret Service protection. Mrs. Johnson left the room briefly on 2 occasions, accompanied by S.A. Kivett and W. Taylor. I had several conversations with the vice president about moving the airplane, and at one time he considered moving it to Carswell Air Force Base and driving the distance. We also considered just moving it to another location at Love Field, and this is what I told S.A. Kivett to have them do, and to have enough fuel for cross-country flight. I told the vice president that we would drive to the airport with he and Mrs. Johnson in separate cars, and that I wanted him to stay down below window level, and that Mrs. Johnson would be accompanied by agents. I had previously told Atzak Johns in the presence of the vice president that he should go out of the hospital and get 2 cars and stand by, preferably unmarked police cars with police drivers who were familiar with Love Field, etc. I told him we would not return to the motorcade cars. I also told him that we would take an unknown route and to make sure that the drivers were thoroughly familiar with the area. Atzak Johns reported back that he had this set up. The vice president and I were both questioning the feasibility of leaving the hospital by the same way in which we had entered it. I told Atzak Johns to check on the various exits from which we might enter the car and make a hasty evacuation and get cars at other exits if this could be worked out. While he was gone, Atzak Kellerman and Mr. Ken O'Donnell came into the room. We learned that the president had died. The vice president was concerned about wanting to leave quickly, as he had been advised to do, and which he now felt that he should do, but he was also very much concerned about leaving without Mrs. Kennedy. It was finally agreed, at the advice of Mr. O'Donnell and others of us, that we would leave the hospital and go to Air Force One, President Kennedy's former airplane, with Mr. O'Donnell and others bringing Mrs. Kennedy as soon as they could remove the body. We were told that Mrs. Kennedy would not leave without President Kennedy's body. While we were in this room, we were visited by Malcolm Kilduff of the White House press secretary's office. I also recall other White House staff people coming in, among whom I think were Mr. Larry O'Brien and I believe Mr. Dave Powers. So Dave Powers did make his way from Dealey Plaza to the hospital. How the fuck did he do that? And why did he get out of the car if they were just going to go to the hospital anyway? Why is that? Still looking for that answer. I remained in the room with the vice president at all times. Mrs. Johnson made some notes regarding the situation. We started to leave the room and to evacuate the hospital, and since 8-Sack Johns had not returned, I grabbed one of the agents and told him to run ahead and get the cars ready. And we started out. As soon as we got outside, we loaded into an unmarked police car, the driver of which was Jesse Curry, police chief of Dallas. The vice president and I got into the back seat. He got in first and slumped below window level, and I got in after him. Congressman Homer Thornberry got in the front seat. I was seated behind Congressman Thornberry. Mrs. Johnson was in the company of S.A.'s Kivett and W. Taylor, and also Congressman Brooks. S.A. Glenn Bennett had also been working very closely with our group since our arrival at the hospital. And he got in the car with Mrs. Johnson. I ordered the driver, Chief Curry, to drive out and head for Love Field. Congressman Albert Thomas was walking and seeing Congressman Thornberry. He called out for us to stop and pick him up. I don't believe he saw the vice president. I told the driver to continue, but by this time Congressman Thomas was by the side of the car. The vice president ordered the driver to stop, whereupon we immediately took the congressman aboard and proceeded again. Congressman Thomas got in the front seat with Congressman Thornberry being moved over closer to the driver. The vice president then requested that Congressman Thornberry climb over into the back seat, which he did. Congressman Thornberry took a position on the window side behind the driver. We then had the vice president in the middle of the back seat. We were momentarily blocked by traffic, which was coming onto the hospital access road. A delivery truck, I believe, rapid police assistance got us through this obstacle, and we continued to the airport. We had motorcycle escort, which began using sirens. We asked Chief Curry to stop them from using sirens, which he did by use of his radio. When we approached the apron at Love Field, I called on my portable radio. That would be aboard Air Force One rapidly and to be ready to receive us aboard. They replied that the plane was ready. The vice president and I practically ran up the ramp, followed by the others. I gave several orders to agents and Air Force crewmen about checkpoints at the front and rear of the plane and pulling down all shades. The vice president went to the stateroom area, and Mrs. Johnson joined us there. Congressman Thornberry, Brooks, and Thomas were also there. The vice president told me to observe all of the events that I could and to tell my agents to make notes and also to tell any of his staff to do likewise. I passed these instructions on to my agents. I went everywhere the vice president did and was present when he called Attorney General Kennedy. He asked the Attorney General about the legal aspects of taking the oath of the president, such as when, where, and who should administer it. The vice president placed calls to the office of Federal Judge Hughes, and he received a call from the Justice Department. He instructed Marie Femmer to take down the wording of the oath. The vice president had another phone conversation with the Attorney General. The vice president advised me and others that Judge Sarah Hughes would be coming to the plane, and I advised other agents and had them pass the word to local security officials. He also asked me to check on the status and location of Mrs. Kennedy and the president's body and inform him of their estimated time of arrival. Mrs. Kennedy and the president's body arrived at the plane ahead of Judge Hughes, the vice president, and Mrs. Johnson went to Mrs. Kennedy's bedroom to comfort her. When Judge Hughes arrived, the oath was administered, and Cecil Stoughton, White House photographer, took photos of this event. His photos show most of those who witnessed this event within the stateroom through the passageway door leading to the front of the plane. There were some other witnesses who were not in the picture since we were on the side of the stateroom where the photographer was. These persons included myself, an Air Force steward, unidentified, and an agent who was stationed at the rear of the plane with the president's body. The oath of office was administered at approximately 2:40 p.m. CST. Judge Hughes and Chief Curry disembarked from the plane, and the plane was airborne from Love Field, Dallas, 2:47 p.m. en route to Andrews Air Force Base. The foregoing accounts of events is true and accurate to the best of my recollections. All right. Statement. ASAC. Thomas Lem Johns, Vice Presidential Detail. Date November 29th, 63. Statement regarding events in Dallas, Texas on Friday, November 22nd, 63. This personal statement is being submitted at the direction of SAIC Rufus Youngblood, Vice Presidential Detail, Office 1-22. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, I was assigned to the Vice Presidential Detail, Office 1-22, and was working the movements of Vice President Johnson during his travels on this date with ASIC Youngblood. ASIC Youngblood was riding the Vice President's car on all movements, and I worked the Vice Presidential follow-up car. Special Agent Warren W. Taylor was also working all Vice Presidential movements on this date and was assigned to Mrs. Johnson. S.A. Taylor rode the Vice Presidential follow-up car when Mrs. Johnson rode in the car with the Vice President. On this same date, the Vice President and party arrived Love Field, Dallas, Texas at 11:35 a.m. Central Time. President Kennedy and party arrived Love Field at 11:38 a.m. Central Time, and at 11:50 a.m. Central Time, the presidential and vice presidential motorcades departed Love Field en route to the Trade Mart where the president was to speak. The motorcade and security personnel were as follows: President's car, Secret Service follow-up car, Vice President's car, ASIC Youngblood, Vice President's security car, ASIC Johns, and SAs Taylor and Kivett. The Vice Presidential security car was a 1963 or 1964 Mercury four-door sedan driven by a man whom I believe to be an employee of the Texas Department of Public Safety. Mr. Cliff Carter, aide to Vice President Johnson, was seated in the middle front seat. S.A. Kivett, who was the Vice Presidential Detail's advance man for Fort Worth, Dallas, was seated in the right front seat. S.A. Taylor was seated in the left rear seat and was seated in the right seat of the car. It doesn't say. And blank was seated in the right rear seat of the car. Why is that blank? Looking at the length, I'm assuming that's John's. The motorcade had passed through the downtown section of Dallas, and at approximately 12:35 p.m. Central Time, I heard two shots, not knowing whether they were firecrackers, backfire, or gunshots. These two shots were approximately 2 or 3 seconds apart, and at this time, we were on a slight downhill curve to the right. On the right-hand side of the motorcade from the street, a grassy area sloped upward to a small 2 or 3 foot concrete wall with sidewalk area. When the shots sounded, I was looking to the right and saw a man standing and then being thrown or hit to the ground, and this together with the shots made the situation appear dangerous to me. I estimate that the motorcade was going approximately 12 to 14 miles per hour at this time, and I jumped from the security car and started running for the Vice President's car. I felt that if there was danger due to the slow speed of the motorcade, I would be more of assistance and in more of a proper location with the Vice President's car. Before I reached the Vice President's car, a third shot had sounded, and the entire motorcade then picked up speed, and I was left on the street at this point. I obtained a ride back with White House movie men and joined the Vice President and ASIC Youngblood at Parkland Hospital. I did not have any trouble keeping my balance when getting out of the security car, and on this that I based the estimated speed of the motorcade. Also, as the door of the security car opened to the rear, I lost some time in getting out and starting to run for the Vice President's car. At no time did I see any details concerning persons in President Kennedy's car, and his security car was a large one with agents standing on running boards, and this obscured my view of the President's car. I arrived at Parkland Hospital approximately 12:45 at 12:50 p.m. and immediately joined ASIC Youngblood with Vice President Johnson. In a few minutes, I was directed by ASIC Youngblood, at the request of Vice President Johnson, to go to ASIC Kellerman and to give him a report on the condition of President Kennedy to Vice President Johnson. I found ASIC Kellerman and conveyed this message to him, and then I returned to close proximity of Vice President Johnson. Mr. Ken O'Donnell came to the Vice President and advised that President Kennedy was in a bad way and advised Vice President Johnson to return to Washington, D.C. Those present with Vice President Johnson were Mrs. Johnson, Congressman Homer Thornberry, ASIC Youngblood, and most of the time Congress Jack Brooks and Special Agent Jerry Kivett and Warren Taylor. ASIC Youngblood then requested that I obtain transportation cars for the Vice President and to have drivers who were thoroughly familiar with any and all routes from the hospital to Love Field and to have added police protection placed at Love Field. I went outside the hospital and spoke to an inspector, highest-ranking police officer. We discussed cars for use of the Vice President and possibly other members of his party, and he offered the use of several unmarked police cars. Chief Curry, Dallas Police, then joined us, and in further discussion, they stated that they would send a large police detail to Love Field and completely secure it. The police inspector himself then stated that he would drive Vice President Johnson to the airport. I returned to the Vice President and ASIC Youngblood and heard Ken O'Donnell inform Vice President Johnson that President Kennedy had died. To the best of my knowledge, I believe that the Vice President learned from Mr. O'Donnell and Mrs. Kennedy was getting a casket and would proceed as soon as she could to Air Force One for return to Washington, D.C., with President Johnson on the same plane. At the request of ASIC Youngblood, I then went and got the hospital building superintendent, and with him started looking and checking out another exit to use from the hospital. I was gone about 10 minutes, and when I returned to the last location in the hospital of the Vice President and ASIC Youngblood, I learned that they had just departed the hospital en route to Air Force One. I went outside the hospital with Mr. Cliff Carter and Mr. Jack Valenti, staff member. Well, not yet, right? Not a staff member yet. Staff member and friend of Vice President Johnson, respectively, and Captain Cecil Stoughton. I obtained a police car and driver, and all of us drove to Love Field, and I went aboard Air Force One and rejoined the Vice President and ASIC Youngblood. I then conferred with Colonel James Swindle, pilot of Air Force One, and a decision was made to remove seats from small rear compartment of Air Force One for use of Mrs. Kennedy and the casket containing President Kennedy's body. Also, passengers on board were identified, and a manifest started at front entrance to Air Force One, the rear entrance being reserved for Mrs. Kennedy. Via radio telephone, I then talked with SAIC Bain, White House detail, Washington, D.C., and informed him that Mrs. Kennedy and the body of President Kennedy would accompany the Vice President back to Washington, D.C. At approximately 2:30 p.m., federal judge Sarah Hughes came aboard Air Force One and gave the presidential oath of office to Vice President Johnson, witnessed by all at the request of the Vice President. Air Force One then departed Love Field, Dallas, Texas, immediately following the above at 2:50 p.m. Central Time, en route for Andrews Air Force Base, Maryland, and I was aboard that plane. Signed, Thomas Johns, ASAC 1-22. All right, so let me see. This one is memorandum to the chief from S.A. Jerry Kivett, Vice Presidential Detail. Statement regarding events in Dallas, Texas on Friday, November 22nd, 1963. I arrived Love Field, Dallas, Texas at approximately 10:30 a.m. Central Time from Fort Worth, Texas. I was driven from Fort Worth by S.A. Warner Dallas Field Office, and S.A. Shannon was also in the car. S.A. Shannon had worked the previous midnight at Fort Worth and was catching a commercial flight from Dallas to Austin in order to work the following midnight at the LBJ Ranch. Upon arrival at Love Field, I immediately contacted S.A. Lawson and assisted him in advance arrangements prior to the arrival of the President and Vice President. I assisted him in arranging motorcade cars and various other duties as he directed. I contacted the local representative of Continental Airlines and obtained 4 pillows to be used in case the President and his party wanted to sit on the back of the convertible. I was in constant contact with Art Bales as to the exact location and time of the arrival of the vice presidential and presidential aircraft. I also conferred with Mr. Jack Putterbaugh, political advance officer, on who was going to greet the vice president when he arrived. Who the fuck does Jack Putterbaugh actually work for? Air Force 2 with the vice president and party aboard arriving 11:35 a.m. Central Time. I was at the foot of the ramp when the vice president and Mrs. Johnson party disembarked. Vice presidential detail agents accompanying the vice president were ASIC Youngblood, ASIC Johns, and S.A. Taylor. Other White House detail agents were also on board. The vice president was greeted by the local committee consisting of 15 persons. ASIC Youngblood and ASAC Johns remained in close proximity to the vice president. S.A. Taylor remained in close proximity to Mrs. Johnson. And I was making sure that the vice president and others moved to the proper area to greet the president, and also was keeping an eye on the presidential plane so as to advise ASIC Youngblood of its location. Air Force One with the president and party aboard arrived at 11:40 a.m. CST. Vice president was at the foot of the ramp to greet the president and Mrs. Kennedy when they descended the steps of the plane. After the president was greeted by the reception committee, same committee that greeted the vice president, he walked past his automobile and up to the crowd, which was behind a waist-high cyclone fence. He and Mrs. Kennedy began to shake hands with those assembled there. The vice president and Mrs. Johnson also went past their cars to the fence and also started shaking hands. ASIC Youngblood and ASIC Johns remained in close proximity to the vice president, and with S.A. Taylor in close proximity to Mrs. Johnson. I was alternating between remaining in close proximity to the vice president and seeing that the vice president's car and follow-up car were staying right behind the presidential car and follow-up car as President and Mrs. Kennedy and Vice President and Mrs. Johnson moved down the fence to their left, shaking hands. When President and Mrs. Kennedy took their positions in the car, I assisted ASIC Youngblood and ASIC Johns in getting Vice President and Mrs. Johnson in their car. The vice presidential car was a 1964 Lincoln convertible with the top down. The driver was Herschel Jacks, Department of Public Safety, and ASIC Youngblood rode in the right front seat. In the back seat were Senator Yarborough, Mrs. Johnson, and the vice president. Left to right, as the motorcade started moving out, I ran alongside the vice president's car for approximately 15 to 25 yards and then jumped into the vice presidential follow-up car, a 1963 Mercury four-door sedan. This vehicle was driven by Joe Rich, Department of Public Safety, with Cliff Carter, executive assistant to the vice president, in the middle front seat, and I was in the right front seat. S.A. Taylor and ASAC Johns were in the back seat, left and right sides respectively. The motorcade proceeded out of the airport and along the motorcade route. The entire route was well lined with people on several occasions when crowds were large. I opened the door of the vehicle to be prepared to get out if necessary. During the entire parade route, I could not see the presidential car well, but I could see the presidential follow-up car and observe the agents standing on the running board. On one occasion, exact location unknown, the presidential car stopped and a few well-wishers went over to the car to shake hands. The stop was very brief and none of the crowd made an attempt to shake the vice president's hand. During this time, I had the door open and was standing halfway out of the car, prepared to go up to the vice president's car if necessary. During the motorcade, as we moved further downtown, the crowd became increasingly heavy, and I noticed numerous persons watching the motorcade from windows of all the various buildings we passed. All agents in the vice presidential follow-up car were closely observing the crowd, both along the streets and watching from the windows. Approximately 3 minutes before the assassination in the very downtown part of Dallas, I observed a young white male, approximately 21 years old, running toward the presidential car. As he got alongside the presidential follow-up car, S.A. Reedy, who was working the right front running board, jumped down from the follow-up car and forcibly shoved this individual back into the crowd. We continued along the motorcade route and turned off Main Street. At this point, S.A. Lawson in the lead car gave 5 minutes to the trademark signal. Moments later, the first shot was heard. See additional statement for actions during and after the assassination. That's from S.A. Jerry Kivett. So numerous agents saw this young white kid, running towards the presidential car at some point. There might be a photograph, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. But imagine if that was some time traveler who was attempting to go back and alter history. Maybe somebody from the future tried to change history. And so if that was the case, hypothetically, this would be the proof that you cannot go back and change history. You can only go back and participate in it. Something to think about. But let me see. How long is this statement? All right, we got another multi-page statement from Mr. Jerry Kivett, and I'm tired, and it's Saturday. So that's going to do it for today. Got through about 7 or 8 pages. So tune in on Monday. I'm going to take tomorrow off, and I got day 0 tomorrow anyway. So I will be back on Monday, where we will continue to teach Kennedy researchers how to do math with 8 plus 2 equals 10. Part, what will that be, 4? Something like that. All right, guys. If you haven't bought the book, buy the fucking book. All right? See you guys next time.